discussions. Recording is progress. Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Corey. You figured it out. Wonderful. So it's good to have a little bit of time for that. In terms of the audience, we have all kind of members from the department. So come from, we got faculty, we got trainees, we got admin people, we got EML people, the medical lab. We got pretty much anyone gets the invite. And now there are 34 people on the call. Probably keep growing because there's a constant coming and going. So, but why don't we start 4:05, Veronica? So I introduced Dr. Andrea Deyrup. So ready, Dr. Deyrup? So welcome to our meeting, our conversations on racism in the Department of Pathology of the Emory University School of Medicine. Andrea Deyrup received her undergrad degree from Princeton University in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology before joining the University of Chicago for her Ph.D. Pathology in 1997, MD in 2000, and residency in Anatomic Pathology 2000-2003. She completed her formal training in soft tissue pathology at Emory. I'm sure Sharon, I saw Sharon before, was involved in that and joined the faculty as an assistant professor in 2004. After leaving Emory in 2009, she helped found a new medical school in Greenville, South Carolina, the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, Greenville. Since 2015, Dr. Deyrup's career has focused entirely on medical education. At that time, she joined the faculty of the Duke Pathology Department in the Duke Health System as course director of the Duke School of Medical Pathology course. In January 2019, she was named the Director of Undergraduate Medical Education for the Pathology Department. She also serves as on the Undergraduate Medical Education Council for the Association of Pathology Chairs, APC, and participated in the 2020-2021 Duke Teaching for Equity Fellows program. Dr. Deyrup is one of the co-editors of the new Robbins Pathology textbook, which is, for those who don't know, that Robbins is the Bible or the Quran or whatever, the Torah of pathology has been since I was a kid, which means a long time ago. She has served on the editorial board of Human Pathology since 2007, as the treasurer for the International Society of Bone and Soft Tissue Pathology from 2008 to 2013, and associate editor for Case Studies for Human Pathology 2017-2019. So a very, very distinguished speakers that we're honored to have today. And without further ado, welcome to our series, Dr. Deyrup, your podium.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. All right, and in the mantra of our generation, can you see my screen? Anyone? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, so thank you very much for this invitation. This talk is based on a grand rounds I gave at Duke, which was about 50 minutes long. So I've condensed it for this so that we can have time to talk. If you're interested in seeing that talk, please shoot me an email. My email is in the lower right. I'm delighted to be here with my colleague, Dr. Joseph Graves, Jr. from North Carolina A&T State University. All of the pretty figures at the top belong to him. I just have the little one in the lower right. He'll be chatting in the chat and will also be part of our conversation. So he's an evolutionary biologist who has written extensively on race and medicine, and I'll talk about him a little bit more in this presentation. I'd like to draw your attention to two things. If you're interested, go ahead and do a screenshot. You'll notice there's a QR code on the left, as well as a URL. That will take you to a folder where you can access all of the PDFs for the references in this talk, as well as some general references and something I call the Deyrup disparities document, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. And finally, before I get started, I'd like to say that while this is something that I'm very passionate about, it is not my lived experience. I am speaking to you from a position of incredible privilege. And I know that this is a very diverse audience, and I would like to reach out to you and to say that if you notice something where I could be more mindful or thoughtful, I would be grateful if you would bring that to my attention. All right. So for my disclosure, as Dr. Silvestri mentioned, I'm an editor-author of 2 of the Robbins pathology textbooks. I'll be focusing mostly on Robbins' basic pathology in this talk, in part because that is the book that we are currently revising with Dr. Graves' help. And so now is really the time to start looking at how race is addressed in this medical textbook. And when I started looking at this, I began doing this initially for my students. I went through Robbins' basic pathology and did a search for race using search terms like Asian or African or Hispanic. And I came up with a large number of diseases for which we discuss differences in epidemiology or prognosis. So there are probably close to 40 of these. And for my students, I'm doing a deep dive on each of these, where I go into the literature and try to get a deeper understanding of what causes this disparity has, what some of the effects might be, and to provide context. Now, let me give you some context for some of these diseases. So here are some quotations from the book that are addressing disparities in disease. So we talk about cardiac amyloidosis in African Americans, about the carrier frequency of cystic fibrosis in Caucasians, gallstone prevalence in American Indians, and then, for example, EGFR mutations in whites and Asians. Now, this has outdated terminology, but that is actually the least of the issues that we're looking at right now. I want to begin by saying that when these sentences were written, they were written with the best of intentions. The thinking is that epidemiology and differences in prognosis are critical facts for our medical students to know so they can become great clinicians. And this information was intended actually to help patient care. But as you all know, in this day and age, intention is not good enough. What we really have to do is to question if we're doing harm or if we're not. So are we doing harm? Is this a problem at all? And I would contend that the use of race in medical literature is a problem. So one of the ways it's a problem is what I call buzzword bingo. So we start these associations with medical students. We say, African American, sickle cell disease, white, cystic fibrosis, American Indian, gallstones. And you may think that, well, these are just preclinical years and the students will surely learn the subtle nuances when they go on the wards in residency as young attendings. But I would counter with the fact that there are misconceptions I learned 25 years ago at the University of Chicago that I did not unlearn until the last year or so when I began really doing a deep dive on disparities. So we create this buzzword bingo, which is reinforced by multiple choice questions. We're very careful at Duke not to use race or ethnicity in our questions, but that is by no means universal across the country. And in fact, the USMLE is currently just now pulling those sorts of distractors, I would say, from their questions. But there are a lot of old questions on shelf exams that students will continue to encounter. So we have this association, and this can cause patient harm. So say a Navajo woman presents to a clinic with right upper quadrant pain, and an eager young attendee thinks, aha, gallstones, and misses an ectopic pregnancy. Now you may think that's not going to happen, right? Well, here is an example from an excellent article called The Misuse of Race in Medical Diagnosis, where the author recounts an anecdote about a childhood friend who was not diagnosed with cystic fibrosis until she was 8 years old, even though she presented multiple times with symptoms. And it was only when a radiologist was able to see her chest film and had no idea of the color of her skin and said, who's the kid with cystic fibrosis, that the diagnosis was made, right? So we create these associations and they are locked in with our students and we can create patient harm. So let's use an even larger lens, right? So in addition to individual patients, is there a way that this constant alignment of different, quote, races with disease creates societal harm? And I would say, yes, it does. That if we constantly label one population as being prone to disease, perhaps considered to be genetically inferior, and we lay a series of potential risk factors at their feet, that we are reinforcing a white supremacy model. So for example, let's look at the diseases that are discussed in Robbins, right? So I have redlined the diseases that are described as being worse or more common in patients of African descent. And then you can see here in green that we mentioned the ones that are more common or have a worse prognosis in patients of European descent. African Americans make up about 13 to 14% of the population of the United States. And most of the diseases we're talking about here are ones where we emphasize that they have a worse prognosis. So I think of this as being something that as a medical student would be troubling to me, seeing this. And I think it would also be troublesome for how our medical students create an image of their future patients. But let's take a look at how a medical student might feel. Dr. Damon Tweedy was a Duke medical student who is now on the faculty as a psychiatrist. And he wrote a book called Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflections on Race and Medicine, in which he says, it seemed that no matter the body part or organ system affected, the lecturers would sound a familiar refrain. It's more common in Blacks than in whites. Each time the demographics of a new disease came up in a lecture, my stomach twisted. I knew where this was heading. Seated in a sea of mostly white and Asian faces, I wondered how this information affected their views of Black people, whether they already had biases against us, and whether any of this impacted the way they saw me. So if we're going to talk about race in education, we first have to define our terms, right? So what is race? So in modern biology, races are defined by two criteria, okay? The amount of genetic variation within and between groups, and phylogenetic evidence of a unique lineage. Now we can immediately discount the second criterion because that would imply that in modern humans, a population had become so geographically isolated that there was no genetic contribution back and forth with any other humans, and that simply hasn't happened. Now, regarding the amount of genetic variation within groups, we've known for a long time that humans show more variability within so-called races than between them. Now, we do have geographically based genetic and physical differences, and the greater the geographic distance, the greater the differences. But we share 99.9% of our DNA. And we could talk about statistics, and I could bring up a bunch of evolutionary biology and population genetics, but let's talk about disease, because that's really what we're focused on here. I'm not going to try to convince you with statistics. We have to begin, in my mind, with the belief that race is a social construct, that it is not biologically based, okay? There's not a genetic basis for this, and Dr. Graves can speak more to this in our discussion. Race as a social construct really came into the forefront when in the era of colonialism and slavery. Now, humans have always been aware of differences between groups because that's part of our tribalism. But only with colonialism and slavery did it become really necessary for the upper group, the supreme group, to find a way to justify the enslavement, torture, exploitation of fellow humans who often were fellow Christians, right? So particularly in America, you had white Christians who had to find a way of justifying this. And race became a very useful way to do that. Now, I've put two references at the bottom if you'd like to read more about this. Also, it's discussed in Dr. Graves' books. So here you can see an image from the 1700s looking at the 5 races based on different skull shapes and sizes. So there were the Caucasians, the Mongoloid, which are the Asians, the Malay, which are the Pacific peoples, Ethiopian, which were the Africans, and then the Americans, which were the American Indians. Now, if we fast forward a couple of hundred years, you'll see that really not much has changed, although the definition of what is white has had an interesting trajectory in our past, and that is worth looking into a little bit more if you have time. But you'll see here once more, there are 5 races according to the Census Bureau. And if you think about it just for a moment, those are really large categories. Now, I'm not going to talk here really about which terminology to use, because that is actually a quite lengthy discussion, but I will direct you to the reference listed at the bottom, and that PDF is in my box folder. So let's look at some of these large categories we're talking about. Let's talk and see how well these work in the context of disease. So this is an image of Asia taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you can see right away that this is a very large expanse, geographical expanse, which will increase your genetic variability. Now, the Middle East is considered part of Asia, though that is now part of white people, according to the US Census. But regardless, we're talking about a huge expanse here, from Russia to Japan, Philippines, including India and China. So let's take a basic sentence like EGFR mutations and looking at the percent of those in pulmonary adenocarcinoma in people who are called white and people who are called Asian. And this is part of what is done for determining treatment. So as part of my deep dive, I pulled up a whole slew of papers. And as you can see that while we have this blanket idea of Asians, right, there's incredible variability just here based on country of origin. And I also have in my disparity document for my students, they have them based on race and ethnicity as well. So you can see that Asian is really not a meaningful category in terms of looking at a disease. So let's look at another continent. Let's look at Africa. Now, Africa has tremendous genetic variability, which Dr. Graves may speak to later. And this here is looking at the hemoglobinopathies on the continent. And as you all know, and if you don't, I'll give it just a brief update for those who are not physicians. Sickle cell disease is closely linked to falciparum malaria. Because if you are heterozygote for this particular allele, it'll have a protective effect on you if you get infected by malaria. And so areas that had malaria tend to have an increased incidence of hemoglobin S and hemoglobin C. And we also see other blood diseases in this area as well. So if you're looking at Africa, you would see here that we have a lot of hemoglobin C on Western Africa, and then in Central Africa, a lot of hemoglobin S. But there are other areas where there isn't either of these. So you can see that in the Sahara region, which is here in white, that really there aren't mosquitoes in the desert. So there really was no pressure for this particular allele. And there are also variabilities depending on whether your tribe was in a mountainous area, which was at an elevation that did not have mosquito pressure. So if we look at this, and then we put next to it a map of where enslaved peoples came from in the early history of our country, even knowing nothing about the United States, you might say that you would expect that the descendants of these peoples would have a high incidence of hemoglobin S and hemoglobin C. And we know that. Here's just one example from Howard University from a sickle cell screening clinic, where we can see, yes, indeed, we have hemoglobin C and we have hemoglobin S. So you may be thinking, okay, I can't use race, and I surely can't use, say, African-American, even though we think of sickle cell as an African-American disease, because clearly it doesn't affect all of Africa. But I could say, well, it's related to being descended from an enslaved people. So if a patient comes into a clinic, I might extrapolate from what I see to thinking that this person might have sickle cell. But before you go there, we have to recognize that a rising share of the US Black population is foreign born. So just because someone is technically African-American does not mean that they are descended from slaves and that they had the same evolutionary pressure in their history. Furthermore, we have a great deal of admixture in the United States. So we actually have a lot of European ancestry in African-Americans, and there's also African ancestry in Europeans. So basically at this point, I hope you're thinking that race is clearly not a meaningful or useful teaching point to use when looking at disease. I'd like to come down briefly on just one example of looking at race in disease to see if there is something useful we can get from the data. So this is looking at a particular disease that can be seen in African Americans. It's called cardiac amyloidosis, and is due to a mutation in the transthyretin gene. So transthyretin is a protein that transports thyroxine and retinol in the blood and in the CSF. And it typically is a tetramer, which can dissociate and deposit as amyloid. And in 1989, a pro-amyloidogenic mutation was identified in a 68-year-old African-American man. And since that time, we've found that about 3 to 4% of African-Americans have this mutation and therefore have this increased risk of this cardiac disease. By comparison, it is vanishingly rare in patients of European descent. So it's autosomal dominant with variable penetrance. And it can mimic a disease that's very common in this population. So hypertensive heart disease is something you would expect to see in older men. Now, people who have this typically die from disease 2 to 6 years after diagnosis. So looking at this allele frequency, it was thought that perhaps there was some sort of founder effect, similar to what we see in sickle cell disease in this country. Unfortunately, the research was done, and they discovered that, in fact, a similar area to where we saw hemoglobin C has a high incidence of this particular allele, as well as the area that we saw hemoglobin S. And once more, let's bring up this map of enslaved peoples. And you will see that we can understand now why you would have a high risk of cardiac amyloidosis in the descendants of enslaved peoples. Now, this may, if this were all we had, it would be an interesting story, right? We could predict they would have this. But it turns out, in fact, there's a drug that we can use that will help these patients. So there is a drug that will bind to thyroxine and will slow the progression of the amyloidosis, right? And improve function for these patients. Unfortunately, the cost of this drug is $250,000 per year. So clearly there are policy issues we need other people to work on as well. But part of the reason why the cost is so high is because it's considered an orphan drug, right? It's an orphan disease, so few people have it. Well, maybe it's because we're not looking for it. And we don't actually need to do a cardiac biopsy to assess this. You can use imaging and we can determine whether someone has amyloidosis. So clearly there's something that we could be doing to help patients. So we put together, this has been a sort of a rapid run through this. Is race in our undergraduate medical education, in Robbins, is it data or is it distraction? And I hope even in this short talk, you've already said, no, we can't talk about race. Race is not important. We recognize it's useless. So how about disparities? Are disparities in Robbins data or distraction? And I would say yes, they can be both. So it's data if we can say, we should look at this patient population and do this screening test so that we can treat this cardiac amyloidosis and take better care of our patients. It's distraction if we turn it into factoids and associations, cystic fibrosis, white, okay? So what do we do from here? So as we started looking at this, early on, this issue was brought up. Well, what if our instructors aren't comfortable discussing this material, right? We're not trained in talking about race. I'm here to talk about the Krebs cycle or, what a pulmonary alveolus looks like. I'm not here to talk about race. And if we put in something about this particular disease, cardiac amyloidosis, and we point out the origin of this allele is in West Africa, in regions that contributed enslaved persons to North America, which is important because it gives us an idea of the genetic background and the populations affected. What if an instructor says, I'm not comfortable talking about slavery or racism? And I would just say, if you're not comfortable talking about racism at this point in American history, you need to find a way to get comfortable, right? Because we really need to change what's going on. And so I encourage all of you to lean in, to take the risk. Then the other thing we have to talk about is what is important. And I know that Dr. Parker and Dr. Hill are well aware of this, that there is this mountain of information that we are supposed to share with medical students, right? It's like, it's this legacy of this is what is important, right? So when I brought up the amyloidosis to one of my authors, I was told, this is a minor variant of a rare disease. We don't need to include this. And I said, well, it's 4% of 14% of Americans. And by comparison, we have 2 whole pages in Robbins on rheumatic heart disease, which affects essentially nobody in the United States, right? Now, admittedly, Robbins is an international textbook, and pediatric populations outside of the United States are greatly affected by rheumatic heart disease. But I think we really need to question, what are we teaching and why are we teaching it? Is it just because it's got a great gross image and some lovely microscopy, or are we actually trying to help our students and their patients? So what do we do next? We're ready to change, right? So I'm a scientist. This has to be driven by data. So there are some people who might say, well, race is meaningless, so let's just remove every racial term. And then immediately the backlash comes up with, well, that's politically correct. You're just being politically correct. And my point is, no, we have to be scientifically correct. We have to do thoughtful, mindful analysis of the material and drive this with data. So I'll give you an example of that. And we need to provide context. right? So that's part of what I do in my disparities document, and I'll show you an example of that. And we need to be inclusive. So what do? So you're me and you're getting ready to go. The first thing you do, you bring in an expert. And I just have a peach of a colleague in Dr. Joseph Graves. He's at a historically Black university just up the road, and he's been a fantastic colleague. Dr. Kumar and the rest of us requested Elsevier to bring him on as a paid consultant for the next edition of Robbins, because we recognize that the four of us need to be inclusive and we need to bring an expert. And so I'm very grateful to have him. He has 3 books out on race and medicine and evolution. Racism, Not Race is just coming out this fall. And he also has nearly 100 publications on race, evolutionary medicine, and medicine. So he's just a fantastic colleague. We also need to bring in the medical students, because to be honest, they are a lot more sensitive and a lot more plugged in than old fogies, right? So I won't even tell you some of the things that my older faculty tell me, but I really need the students to pipe up and let me know what's going on. So I have a Google Doc for them to let me know of issues. They generally just email me, but it's there for them if they need it. So how are we talking about data-driven? What does this look like? Okay, so here's a sentence from the textbook. Certain individuals seem to be predisposed to keloid formation, particularly those of African descent. And so I emailed the author and I said, I think we should remove this, particularly those of African descent. And in his reply email, he sent me a long paragraph from Up to Date that included this sentence, that keloid, Up to Date says keloids have been reported in 5 to 16% of individuals of Hispanic and African ancestry. And I could say, because I am preparing this document for my students, that I've read more on keloids than probably pretty much anybody else in the state, but I have read reference number 5, and it says dark-skinned individuals form keloids 15 times more frequently than do their lighter-skinned counterparts. Not only did I read this article, but I read about another dozen, and 3 of them also had this exact same statistic, 15 times. I thought that was very unusual. So I went back to the original article that was cited in the 2001 paper. And this paper is from 1969, because keloids are not very sexy right now. No one's doing recent research on keloid incidents. That article had nothing about that being 15 times more frequent in dark-skinned individuals. In fact, it said it was more common in the fair-skinned people. The statistics there, 2.4 to 3.3 are mine. I personally did the math, which was not done apparently by anybody else. So after all of this, right, this is literally hours of work, this is what we ended up with. The author says, okay, this will be our sentence, right? So this is the degree of focus that I'm bringing to this, because I don't want this to be an emotional plea. I don't want it to be something where it's a knee-jerk reaction. I want to understand why it is that we're making these changes. So we also need to provide context. So the statement as it currently is in the 10th edition refers to the fact that 2 to 15% of whites carry the factor 5 Leiden mutation after the Dutch city. Got to mention the Dutch. Dr. Graves and I have talked about how we would rewrite this. So first of all, we don't want to use colors, because that's meaningless, and that is reinforcing, look at the color of somebody's skin, and that'll tell you something about their genes. This is specifically a genetic disease, so we want to refer to ancestry. So we're going to mention European ancestry. And at the same time, we're not going to just leave it at Europeans. We're going to highlight the fact that we also see it in other American groups, largely due to population admixture. It's just a subtle nudge, but it's something to help medical students as they think about this in the future, not just to write on an index card or Anki deck or however they do it, factor 5 Leiden, white. And finally, we want to have inclusive images. So I would ask everybody to go into the chat and please put down what it is you think this skin lesion demonstrates in this person with pigmented skin. Now, if you have absolutely no idea, I'll show you another image. And this one is the exact same etiology, but a different patient. And if you continue to be stuck, and I know that the dermatopathologists know exactly what this is, here's what that same lesion looks like in lightly pigmented skin. And I hope everybody now has seen that this would be the targetoid lesion of erythema migrans, right, which is associated with Lyme disease, all right? So why is this important? So Lyme disease, which is a tick-based disease, if you catch it early, you give the appropriate antibiotics and everybody is fine, right? But if you delay diagnosis, then you can get long-lasting complications, including arthritis and neurological issues. All right. So why is this important related to skin color? So of the patients who had Lyme disease-associated arthritis, 81% did not see the rash, right? So they didn't even know they had this rash. And if you look at it, and this is from a study in Maryland, 70% of white people who had Lyme disease said, yeah, I had that big targetoid rash on my arm, right? Whereas only 25% of patients of African descent saw that, okay? Now, if you look at the association here, if you look at the people who have Lyme disease-associated arthritis, only 11% of white people get it, right? They see the rash, they get the treatment, we're good. But more than 50% of patients of African descent did not ended up with arthritis. Now, you can't say it's a direct cause here, but I certainly think it does point to delay of diagnosis in patients with darkly pigmented skin. So let's come back to our patient. So this is the actual patient image. This comes from a published case report. This was a guy in his 30s, and he had been camping 2 weeks ago and said at the clinic that he had a bug bite, and now he had chills and fatigue. And they looked at this diffuse rash and they said, well, you have cellulitis. Now, I would counter that if a white person showed up, even with a non-classic rash with a history of bug bite while camping, Lyme disease would be near the top of the differential. Now, there are some systemic racism reasons why it would not be at the top if someone is of African American. So unfortunately, about 3 weeks after his cellulitis treatment finished, he presented this way. And this is a seventh nerve palsy, which you can see in Lyme disease. The diagnosis was made at that time. And 8 months after he was finally given the correct treatment, he reports ongoing fatigue, muscle and lower back pain, and cognitive difficulties, although his seventh nerve palsy has partially improved, right? So you can see here, we're talking about people's lives and their livelihoods. And so this is very serious what we're talking about, and we have to give this our full attention. So what can you do? So I like to think about what I care about and what I can do something about. And that's why I'm working on this project with Robbins, because I happen to have a significant overlap here and I do have the ability to work on this. But everybody has a circle of influence. So the people who are here, and I'm speaking mostly the academics, the medical students, residents, faculty, if you write journal articles, if you review journal articles, if you write book chapters, you edit a book, you read a book, you have a voice, okay? So for the first, you can ask, why are we talking about race? Why is race even in this chapter? What is the point of it? I was asked to review a teaching case that began a 48-year-old Caucasian woman. And so I said in my review, why is she really Caucasian? Does she come from the Caucasus Mountains? This is an outdated term that comes from white supremacy. I'm sure the editor was not happy to see what I wrote, but anyway, and how does this have any bearing whatsoever on this case? It's a case of osteoarthritis, right? So there's not even any genetic ancestry which is relevant to this. So I would encourage you to use your voice when you see something like this, to really ask, why are we discussing race? Because I really question, and I think Dr. Graves will support this, whether or not we really need to be talking about race in this way. Now, I will make one aside, which we can talk about as well, that there is a social definition of race, which is very important that we include. And I would say to any students who are present, if you're reading a book, and you don't like something in it, write the publisher, because the publishers are very sensitive to what the consumer wants. And so recently, one of the publishers told me about Marion Sims was mentioned in one of their textbooks about gynecology. Students wrote in and referred to how this man tortured and abused enslaved Black women and did surgery without anesthesia. And Marion Sims is now gone from that book. Okay, so use your voice, hunt these things out. You can always do something. Now, this is my list of references. You can either take a screenshot or you can just wait to the end, because you can get access to all of these on your own. If you take a screenshot of this, which has the URL as well as the QR code. And now let's start our conversation.
I will
Sure,
start.
thank you.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deyrup. So yeah, we have the virtual applause. I don't know if there's a way of doing that. I was struggling with unmuting myself. I don't know what happened with my computer, but thank you so much. It was very, very thought-provoking and a very nice presentation. So we're opening up for question. I see Lara, Eric. I suggest, because there are a lot of people, there are 46 people, to please raise your hand so that I can moderate and we don't have to talk on top of each other. Thanks. Lara, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea, and so good to see you. It's a wonderful talk. It's a great presentation and a great research, and I really admire the work that you are doing. I wanted to mention, I have a comment, and then I want to open up I have a question as well. When I first, some of you may not know, but I'm actually from a small country in the Middle East, and when I came to the US, I'm from Lebanon. And when I came to the US, I would see race, and I had never encountered that before. Nobody asks what your race is in Lebanon. But I would, I would sort of have fun with it. Sometimes I would put Asian, sometimes I would put other, and then sometimes I would put white. But, technically I am Asian, I'm from Asia, the continent. But in any case, I feel like when we refer to people who are American as African American and Asian American, and I feel like we're kind of saying they're not Americans. And I know this is a long-winded discussion, but I really would like to, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, Andrea, when you were talking about how should we refer to them. But I really would like to open this up and see if there is a way that we can maybe refer to different races without making them feel like they don't belong to the United States.
So, Andrea, can I take this one?
Please do.
So, I mean, the problem starts with a level of confusion between what we understand as biological variation. Okay, and people have geographically based biological variation, and it's well known, and the social definition, the social construction of race. And there's a reason why you didn't encounter that in Lebanon. And the reason you didn't encounter in Lebanon is because it is very much an invention of the United States and their colleagues, the Brits, over in the United Kingdom. And that social definition, as Dr. Deyrup pointed out, had powerful implications for where a person could end up in a society. And it was designed solely to maintain social dominance of persons of European descent. That's how it operates. And that's what I discuss in the first of my books, The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium. Now I want to make the point that when you start talking about, people identifying themselves as African Americans, and then drawing the conclusion that those people aren't considered Americans, I mean, that again starts with the fundamental lie of this nation, which is that, that this nation was ever a place where everyone was counted equally and everyone had equal protection of law. That has never been the case at all. So talking about being American, to me, it's a nonsensical thing. It's sort of like saying being a unicorn, because that's something that just doesn't exist. It's always been a case of a nation that was structured on white supremacy, on European supremacy. All of its social institutions, all of its laws, all of its economic activities benefited primarily persons of European descent. So to suddenly say, oh, well, yeah, you should call yourself an American, I mean, to me, that's just nonsensical, because that's not the experience that my people had here. So I mean, I call myself an African American because it identifies a specific historical, social, cultural experience. So that's why I use that term.
Yeah, I mean, I of course, I don't mean to lump everybody in the same bin, because clearly we've all had different experiences. but you know, I think, you know, maybe like person of color or, you know, Black, you know, could still be an American. You know, I don't know. Of course, I am not an African American or Black or whatever the politically correct term is. So I don't really pretend to, but I would feel offended if somebody's going to refer to me a lot as like Middle Eastern American, you know, or it's like, you know, they're putting me in this bin where I'm kind of like still the outsider. You know, and that's where I'm coming from, I guess.
Well, I mean, my answer is that there's no such thing as a quote American, in that simply doesn't exist. And so everybody every group of individuals who came to this country have a unique experience.
Yeah.
And I think we need to validate and understand the uniqueness of those experiences. The only people who try to claim that there is such a thing as American tend to be the people who belong to the hegemonic culture, European culture. And so they talk about Americans, and they're the ones who marginalize and exclude everyone else. So, you know, that's why I think we need to be explicit in talking about cultural historical narratives, because the American thing is just not real. It's sort of like Caucasian. It's not real.
Thank you.
Okay, the next raised hand is David Alter.
I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed your lecture and that I look forward to seeing more of the scholarship come out of your group on this topic, not just limited to the revision of Robbins. And as a clinical chemist, I've been following for the last year and a half the point counterpoint debate about the African American modifier and removing it from the CKD, EPI, and MDRD equations. And when the MDRD was first implemented about 15 years ago, I had a lot of trouble with it because there was no way to qualify or to determine who qualified as African American or not. And so the operational way we got around it at my previous institution was through self-identification. So on that very basis, I've always had trouble with how do you have a binary, if you will, correction factor or modifying factor without criteria or a good way to classify. So I'm glad that that's sunsetting, and I just really enjoyed your talk today.
Thank you very much. It's actually, we are expanding our interests. There are so many things to do. I've brought in a MD PhD from University of Chicago who is a pediatrician and an ethicist. Her PhD is in philosophy. And Dr. Graves and I and Dr. Ross are looking at how not just fixing it in Robbins, but putting race in medical literature on trial through sickle cell disease and cystic fibrosis. So that's an ongoing project.
And Dr. Graves in the chat responded to one of what was, I thought, a very conventional discussion, and that was the prevalence of prostate cancer and hypertension in Black men, and he definitely disarmed that. And I thought that was relatively recent and more data than distraction. So I have learned something new today.
Well, I mean, it's also a question of how the data is gathered. And so much of what we think we understand about human populations is based upon very biased sampling. And, you know, so for example, taking the hypertension case, back in 2005, I looked at all of the genetic studies of candidate genes associated with hypertension risk and hypertension protection. And then I looked at the frequency of those genes in specific populations. And it turns out that African Americans actually have a higher frequency of the hypertension protective alleles and a lower frequency of the hypertension risk alleles. And when you look at populations in Western Africa, who of course are where African Americans their African ancestry was derived from, they don't show any elevated rates of hypertension at all. So elevated risk of hypertension is associated with being racialized in North America and in the Caribbean. And so even when you measure genomic difference, which people tend to want to do, you have to be able to demonstrate that those genomic differences are actually causal for the disease condition that you're trying to study. But to do that, you have to be able to equalize the environmental experiences of the populations in question. So if you're doing a case control study, you have to make sure that the environments of the cases and the controls, in fact, are the same. And that's impossible to do in a racialized society. And so therefore, trying to make claims about genetic causality of various genomic variants is intellectually impossible to do in this society.
Thank you. The next raised hand is Denise Becker, and then we'll go to Ashley Monsrud. Denise, go ahead.
Thank you so much for this great talk. It just, in a way, it clarifies a lot of things, and also because of our current living standards in global world, it just adds more confusion in a way. Because races, maybe 100 years ago, it was a bigger item in people's lives, but right now we are so intermixed. I mean, I'm a hybrid. My mother is a Slav origin and my father is Turkish, so I have traits of both races in a way. And I guess our cultural norms affect our genes, the way we eat our food and everything. So, and also just for the European descent, I just don't know even like what European descent is, because a person from Portugal has very minimal, potentially minimal common traits with a person from Norway. So they might be even more, Portuguese might be closer to a person from Morocco with their cultural habits, or Central America or South America. So I guess it just if you start dissecting, it just goes endless, because we have to go all the way to Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavians and Mediterraneans. So probably the gene pools, since we have such an evolving science now with the genomic applications, I guess that's going to answer a lot of questions, because I don't know how much prone I am to FMF, although I'm half Turkish. So, and I don't know how you can interpret this to medical school students or Robbins or any other textbook, because the world is changing so fast and we are a little behind to catch up with it right now. But great talk. Thank you so much.
So your point is well taken, and a further step is we only see what we look for, right? So one of the things I talk about with my students is that there's this long list of diseases that the Ashkenazi Jewish people are susceptible to. And in part, that's because it was a fairly homogeneous population, which meant it was great for geneticists to study. But what it makes it sound like is that this particular population is prone to lots of diseases. If you email me, I can send you a link to my grand rounds where I go through a couple of other diseases like that. But there's actually a website which looks at the genome-wide screening, which is being done, the diversity of it. And maybe 90% of it is being done in Europeans. And there's a small fraction of Asia, Africa, South America, for example. So if we're not looking, we can't see it. And this has huge implications. So for example, for cystic fibrosis, we do newborn screening. Well, the way that we screen for it is we look for the mutations that are most common in patients of European descent. So the ones that are most common. They've only really started recently looking at cystic fibrosis in Africa, and the mutations tend to be different. And so what we're doing is we're screening to find cystic fibrosis in a population that we are expecting to find it. And we're missing it in the population where it would be harder to diagnose, as in the case I mentioned. And this is extremely important because, as my pediatrics colleague mentioned, she said, if you bring in a 2-month-old with failure to thrive, and it's a white kid, they're going to think, oh, well, it's cystic fibrosis. But if you bring in a Black kid with failure to thrive at 2 months, they're going to think it's neglect because of systemic racism. And so where we look is what we see. And so that's why so much of it refers to, where we can, I use the country, or if the ethnicity is determined, I mentioned that as well.
Yeah, and the support what Dr. Deyrup was pointing out. I mean, since the advent of next generation sequencing in the second decade of the 21st century, we actually know a great deal about geographically based genetic variation in a large number of populations. Clearly not as much as we should about Africa, which, by the way, is where the greatest amount of genetic diversity in the entire human species resides. But in terms of Europe, we actually know a great deal about the genomic variation within Europe and virtually all of its populations. And those things are in easily accessible databases.
Thank you. Next person is Ashley Monsrud to ask a question. Then we're going to have George Birdsong and Bill.
Hey, yes. First off, yes, of course, this was a really great talk. Just a quick question, and I think you guys have kind of hit on it a little bit, but as far as research goes, and it just kind of sparked my interest because we're doing some research on some cervical cancer, and a lot of times the people that we include in our research are mostly white, and I was for this, and you kind of brought up a good point, is cervical cancer really actually increased in African American population or in Africans, and as well as increased mortality, which is the idea that we have now, but I guess I would have to do my own research to confirm that. But that's a pretty widely accepted belief. And should I include that the population that we study is majority African American, specifically since most studies don't include a large predominant African American population. But when is that line appropriate to specify race in research?
So do you want to take that, Joe, and then I can follow up?
Yeah, and again, one of the things it's really hard for me to listen to, and I know it's because I've been working on this problem for 30 years, is the way people use the term race. It always conflates biological variation and socially defined groups. And so one of the real problems, when we do biomedical research studies, is actually clarifying what aspect of the two definitions is relevant to the study in question. And so if what you're interested in is the social lived experiences of women of African descent in the United States, and how that may be playing a role in predisposing them to develop higher rates of a specific disease, in this case, cervical cancer, then I think you need to describe that. But what you're describing is a socially defined group, not a biological race different from that of the others, which quite frankly don't exist. And if what you're interested in is looking for specific genomic variants that are associated with greater cervical cancer risk, then you're going to find those at different frequencies in all populations around the world. And so when people are describing their research designs, they need to be very clear what aspect of this definition is relevant to their study. And that's in fact something that I've been working on with the editors of some of the major journals like Nature and Biomed, Rib, and others, about having people write up their materials and methods in a way that actually makes some biomedical research sense, rather than the smog that we've been living in for the last couple of centuries.
I think one of the challenges is, for example, NIH wants researchers to include a certain percentage of, African Americans, in the study. And then as you're looking to do your publication, sometimes you only see, there's a difference in this population, and that makes it a publishable thing, right? Higher incidence in this group. And so this actually perpetuates this myth that it's important according to race, because, for example, when you talk about cervical cancer, and I haven't gotten to cervical cancer yet. I've done leiomyomas, but I'm working my way through Robbins as we go through each week. I just finished sarcoidosis, which was a bear. But you know, as we look at that, we have to think about things like access to care and poverty and education. And there's so much that brings us in, but we label these populations that, you know, as being prone to these diseases. And there's a social reason to do that, right? If we can say African Americans, right, and that we have studied have a higher rate of this, then you could say, well, maybe we need to do a policy thing, like look to see how we can get more medical care. What is the cause of this? But I think that often, as Dr. Graves has said, there's often this feeling that the race is genetic. And I think it's very challenging. I was actually, a friend of mine was asked to work on a paper looking at different outcomes and types of brain tumors based on different types of Hispanics. And she herself is Hispanic. I said, I would walk away from that. I said, because I do not think that you will come up with anything meaningful. And 5 years from now, they're going to say, wow, this was so far off the spectrum of what is even reasonable. I mean, I think it's a waste of time.
Thank you. So we're going to go with George Birdsong, then Bill and Sanjili. Is that okay if we go a little bit over 5, Andrea and Dr. Grace? Is it okay? Okay, so we'll keep going. Okay, okay. So George, go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, my question actually refers back to Lara's comment earlier about you know, when you use the phrase, if you use a phrase African American or Asian American, you're kind of implicitly othering someone, and which is well, 2 aspects of that. I also have had occasionally decided to have a little fun with those categorizations, because although, you know, most of my life I identify as Black, I actually have a bit of Native American in me. That's where my name comes from, or so I'm told by family members. But my question, I would like to hear yours or Dr. Graves' comments on what language would you use to describe the recent unfortunate incident where a light-skinned male murdered 8 people, 6 of whom were, quote unquote, Asian women in 3 quote unquote Asian-owned businesses. I mean, I guess we're using the social construct of race there, not the genetic, but it's very obviously directed towards a certain subpopulation. That those weren't random, random murders by any stretch of the imagination, nor random choice of businesses.
Oh, and do you want this, or do you want to let me take it?
Why don't you take it and I'll follow up as someone who is Asian-ish.
Yeah. So I mean, my view is that you need to describe people as closely to their ethnic identity as possible. So, for example, I'm married to a woman from Korea, and so she's Korean. Okay, we don't talk about her as being Asian. We say, she says she's Korean. For those businesses that were attacked, since there's really no such thing as Asia, again, that is a construction. Those people came from specific cultures. Were they Chinese? Were they Korean? Were they Hmong? Were they Vietnamese? Were they Laotian? Were they Pakistani? Were they Indian? I mean, so we need to be specific in terms of talking about people rather than throwing them into bins. And so when I write, I'm very careful about whichever categorization scheme I use, I always use the principle of parallelism. So if the scheme is Black, then I use parallel terms: black, white, red, yellow, brown. Those are parallel terms. If I'm talking about ancestry, I'll say European American, African American, Asian American, Middle Eastern American, Mexican American, and so on. So whatever scheme you're using, it should be done in a parallel fashion, so that you're not privileging any group over another. And finally, I'll say I never use the term people of color, precisely because everybody has a color.
And then I would just say from a different point of view, so I think the use of the term Asian in this particular instance, George, is really because this was, and this may not, and I cannot speak exactly to this, right? Because I don't know what was going on in his brain. There has been some suggestion that it was not actually anti-Asian, that it was part of the Christian white supremacy model, which is covered very well in the book White Too Long, which Joe recommended me, and I highly recommend it. However, if you look at who is working typically in massage parlors, it is a marginalized group of, typically women who come from Asian countries, right? So I can't speak to this as saying, this is anti-Asian, what this event was, right? That this was definitely anti-Asian. I think it was definitely white supremacy. And I think the use of the term Asian is in part because if you refer to, and my mother is Chinese, and so she was in college during the Vietnam War, and so everyone thought she was Vietnamese. I mean, it didn't matter. You were slant-eyed, and so therefore you were a gook. And so I think the use of Asian in this term is in that social context of anti-Asian sentiment. Just like when you talk about, anti-African American sentiment, someone can be from Jamaica, right? Or from Africa, and have that, because that's how you're perceived socially. You have yellow skin, you're an Asian, and then it triggers that particular approach. So I'm not saying it was addressed perfectly in the media, but I'm saying that I think that a lot of what this was looking at it, when they have reports of, Korean man in, the Bronx was beaten, and Laotian man in San Francisco was beaten. It's the sentiment comes from Donald Trump and the China virus and the anti-Asian sentiment. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Andrea. So we go with Bill and then Sanjili.
Thank you very much, Guido. I'd like to thank Dr. Deyrup and Graves for this excellent talk. It's really thoughtful talk, and go along with what Laura and George said. The resistance against Asian has probably been a long under-recognized problem. I remember when I did my research as postdoc, there's a white technician and there's a postdoc from Belgium. This white technician said loudly in front of us, saying, people from Europe come to this country to help, but people from Asia come to this country to get benefit. That's very, thinking back, that's very traumatic thing. But I think this country is actually trying to do the best to avoid those resist. Emory Medical School actually is doing something really, really great. Just for the information of people like Laura, May is actually a month of API, and medical school is going to have a series of activities. Happy to include, connect any faculty, especially faculty with Asian association, to those activities. And actually, I'm very glad to hear that two speakers are actually have Asian association with either family members or spouse. Thank you very much for this excellent talk.
Thank you, Bill. Sanjili, please go ahead.
Yes. Hi. I came in on the tail end. I had to go to work, but what I heard, fascinating. But I have a question, and it's just more of a curiosity for me. I'm a nurse, and of course I read, labs. I read chemistry labs and hematology labs and things like that. And when you mentioned the GFR, is that tested in others, or is that always tested in people of African descent? Because I really never paid attention to that until you said something. I went, wait a minute. So is that is that like the standard test for everyone? Or, you know, I'm wondering.
So basically, that's an excellent question, and thank you for coming to the talk. So the test is done for everyone, right? So you want to know how someone's kidneys are functioning. But the problem comes in that there is what they call a race correction. And it was initially based on the thought that people of African descent had greater muscle mass than the wimpy Europeans. And because this is based on the way that you calculate glomerular filtration rate is looking at creatinine, they said, well, we need to do an adjustment, right? And so that's why when you look at a lab test, what they do is they take that number and they multiply it by a certain amount based on the race that you put in, whether it's white or black. A similar thing is done with pulmonary function tests. So they measure how much your volume of lung is and how quickly you can breathe out. The calculation in that is much more hidden. It's actually calculated automatically by the machine based on your race. So it doesn't say like it does for EGFR, black or white. It just says, oh, we know this person is black, so we're going to knock 15% off of this, right? So that is something, and Dr. Graves can certainly speak to this because the debate over EGFR is incredibly sticky and frustrating. But yes, that is true.
And I have a second part. I have a girlfriend who is, and I'd say white, and she married an African-American man, and they had 2 children. And if I'm not mistaken, I think both of her children had cystic fibrosis. They were diagnosed just like that. Reason? They are very, very light-skinned. Very, very. Even though their dad is very dark-skinned, they were very, very light-skinned. And they were, I mean, they knew when they were newborns that they had cystic fibrosis, period. And when you said that, I went, because I do know I have had patients of African descent who had cystic fibrosis, but they weren't diagnosed like early, you know, maybe like 1-2 years later after their birth. So thank you for that.
And also, Sandhya, I'd like to tell you a very interesting story. So the so-called racial identity of my children always depended upon which parent they were with at the time. So when my son was with me, when I was coaching basketball and he was playing basketball, he was black. But he also was an outstanding concert pianist. And he would go to performances with his mother, and then he became Korean. So on the same day, my son could switch racial identity by whether he's playing basketball or whether he's playing piano.
Wow. Incredible.
Okay, well, I don't see any other raised hands. I want to, if we have time, I have a sort of a very short question and comment for Dr. Graves, but it's kind of there's something that he mentioned that it really resonated with me, and it's about you know, the nonsensical definition of race, you know, when it comes to sort of African descent, in the sense that, as he pointed out, you know, the biggest genetic variability that we have observed, you know, with DNA studies come from within Africa, and in fact, the so-called African-American, you know, characterization is very much restricted to specific areas of the African continent in geographical terms, you know, and to me that alone, you know, sort of illustrates the nonsensical nature of mixing together the social construct and the actual genetical data. And I'm glad to hear that, because I try to make that point, you know, as a person who does this work myself, you know, and it was great to hear it from a true expert of the field.
Yeah,
thank
and let me also say that there's a really terrible confusion that people have about this variability, and that's understanding, you know, that the vast majority of genetic variation on this planet held within the continent of Africa. Now, the people who left, okay, pretty much lost variants by genetic drift. And so the way to understand, the amount of, genetic variation in any given region of the world is simply to map it geographically relative to how far it is away from Africa. Now, on the other hand, African Americans are people that were created by historical social process. In the same way the people we call Hispanics were created by a historical social process. In Africa, for African Americans, that was that was chattel slavery and the rape of women of African descent for hundreds of years, because most of the admixture of European genes in African Americans came from the period of chattel slavery. Because afterwards, as Dr. Deyrup pointed out, there were miscegenation laws which prevented the marriage and reproduction of people across race in the United States. So yeah, I mean, people have these, incorrect understandings of biological and social groupings that are usually lumped together in the way they talk about these questions. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to understand that these are really different processes and they need to be separated, and you need to apply the one that is relevant to the question that you're attempting to study.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Graves. I mean, no, that's great. So it's 5:15. I really appreciate you guys staying over time. That was that was very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Deyrup. I'm sorry, Dr. Graves, we didn't introduce you. I guess it sort of slipped through the cracks that you were sort of co-speaker, and apologize for that. Maybe Veronica mentioned that at some point, but
Dr. Deyrup, introduced him too. So
yeah. Okay, but still, Anyway, but thank you so much both for coming, and thank you everyone. We had a peak of around 50 participants, and then as usual, this is a revolving door, as I mentioned before, so people come and go. But thank you very much, and thank you all, and we'll reconvene for our conversations next Thursday, 4 p.m. as always. Thank you.
Okay, and if you could please send me the link when you get it, I'd appreciate it, so I can share it with a medical student. And there was Dr. Damon Tweedy, who wasn't able to be here, wanted to see what you guys are doing at Emory, in part because it is very inspiring. So thank you for starting this a week after George Floyd was murdered. I think that showed an incredible responsiveness that I have not seen really at other institutions, where it seemed that often nothing happened for months. And in fact, there are lots of committees that have met, but real lasting interaction has not happened. And so bringing in staff and faculty together on this, I'm very grateful, because I think it's really important what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Well, we all owe it to Dr. Silvestri's persistence.
absolutely, Dr. Silvestri.
Absolutely.
Dr.
Yes.
Graves, Dr. Silvestri was interested in coming back to Emory and maybe talking about his books and having a book signing. So I told him I'd mention it to you.
Wonderful. And just to next initiative, Andrea, that we're doing is we have this hallway in the department that has been filled with posters. Some posters are back from the 1950s or something, not exactly recent. So we're gonna, as soon as we go back to some kind of normal, we're gonna strip that and make it into the inclusion/George Floyd hallway, with things that will, and it would be nice to have some contribution of some of the things related to some of the things that you mentioned that are very, very interesting. Again, thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.